Good afternoon and welcome to the Downtime Quantification Panel. I want to thank my distinguished guests for being here, Adam Tamburini, Tony Bishop, and Pitt. We want to make sure that today we also want a chance to make this interactive, so we're going to make sure we have time for questions and answer at the end. But what we're looking for today is something that's been sort of the holy grail, I think, of IT operations for a long time, which is quantifying the real cost of downtime. So why don't we start by kicking out the idea of first wrestling with defining downtime. We've got a bunch of different backgrounds here in terms of how we approach the problem, but I'll kick each one of you. Defining downtime, what's a good place to start?
Well, given I'm avoiding downtime, I guess I should start. As a wholesale operator of space, obviously that is what we're after selling. That is the product we have. So the racks come in, the IT equipment. We're providing a number of things. We're providing power. We are providing a network connection. We don't sell the network connection, but that cabinet needs to be connected to the network to make that cabinet worthwhile. If it's not talking to the outside world, it has no value. We're then providing a safe environment for that cabinet. And that safe environment is a very wide term. So that's a temperature, it's a level of humidity, it's a physical level of security. And then the fourth item we're providing, which you've picked up quite cleverly on your analysis, which a lot of people don't pick up, is we're providing a level of access to that cabinet. So one of the things we have to provide is for the operators to be able to access that cabinet and operate that cabinet physically in person, as well as from a technical point of view. So I think those four things are the things we're providing, and therefore a failure of any one of those four things is an outage.
Tony, and I guess one of the questions sort of kick around is some of this a matter of degree? Is any degradation of level of access? Where does that start to kick in for what's an outage and what's not? I mean, if we've got backup, if we've got additional capabilities, is reduced capacity also qualify? I'll kick that over to Tony.
So I think first of all, it's a two-part definition. I think it's a top-down and a bottom-up definition. I think from a top-down, there's factors such as brand reputation, revenue at risk. You also have revenue loss kind of thing from the business side. And then I think from the bottom up, we have our classical definitions, right? There's obviously, there's availability, but that people try to measure. But I think the real thing on the bottom up side that's interesting for people to think about and quantify is the degree, if I use your words then, Eric, of downtime. Because, if you end up on generators in the case of a superstorm, which is an example of something that's happened, the downtime actually didn't occur, right? And then the second part, there was a cost of keeping it up, but there wasn't necessarily a downtime depending on how you define it, right? So off of grid lines and onto generators is typically where a classic definition is. And I think that's where we've got to converge this together in a definition that takes from business impact, both qualitative and quantitative, and then takes from, is it still executing or sustainable even if it's in limited manner? I can't get to the cabinet, but I'm still processing my application. In that case, that becomes part of it and is part of what I think is important in defining.
And I'd look at it, I'm a simple guy, I'm just a facility person. I like Adam's comment, if the network isn't talking to the world, you're down. We at the Institute have long used a definition of downtime as loss of a single rack, some single end user hits return and nothing happens, that's a downtime event. Certainly loss of an entire site is a downtime event. And frankly, downtime to me doesn't have anything to do with how you are maintaining it. Because if you use an alternate source of energy or any of those, that's why you put that stuff there, is to maintain, to avoid the downtime during all of these contemptuous things like Superstorm Sandy and loss of utility, et cetera, et cetera.
So you'd make the case that as long as you've got connectivity, as long as that application availability is there, you don't have to worry about shades of gray in terms of...
Right, there may be
integration
increased
happens.
risk during those windows, clearly, but you're not down.
And a cost,
Sure.
right, to do
Yeah,
business.
absolutely. It costs more to run, sustain on generators than it does on utility typically, absolutely, but it's not down.
I think you then have the softer issue when you can then start talking about A and B power supplies and whether an A supply down or a B supply being down is an outage.
And does that stem from what you've hung on either side of that power? And-
Exactly. From the provider's point of view, it's very easy for us because we have a clear service level which will generally say we're going to provide either an A or a B supply at any one time. So that's clean, but we do appreciate from our customer's point of view, there is still single-corded equipment. There is equipment which maybe wasn't connected in the right way. So we understand the pressure from their side that both A and B need to be up. But the whole point of our design is that we can lose a system or we can maintain a system and the other system provides power to the rack.
Interestingly enough, we've actually seen some SLAs with environments, let's say vaguely similar to yours, an A and a B kind of thing, where the SLA evolved into, we promise both sources, and they just absolutely shot themselves in the foot because now they can't maintain either.
They may as well have a single supply.
That's correct.
In
right.
that situation.
In terms of SLA compliance,
Yeah.
yes.
All right, so it sounds like we're sort of approaching a general idea about definition. Cost is a little stickier. You know, is this something where, I know we talked a little bit in the background about issues of total application cost, the outage, lost business, those kinds of things. Those can soar to pretty significant numbers. Is that really what that real cost of that downtime is? And what's a good way to start approximating that?
Eric, let me jump in on that first and challenge a word. I don't think we should be talking about cost of downtime because there are non-financial costs. There are costs that in 9 years we may have been able to equate them to financials. I love the concept of the impact or the consequence of downtime. Having the red face test about your data center on the front page of the Wall Street Journal may not have any direct financial consequence. It might be a good one, who knows? But there's a great deal of embarrassment in the meantime. So consequence, there are other things other than just costs that we need to crank into this. So.
Yeah, I think, not that Pitt's too old school, but I think one of the things you have to look at is as this world is now becoming, you know, the new business platform is the data center. And whether that data center is provided by, you know, you own it, you source it, you know, you share it, et cetera. If you think in that context, you know, once that goes down, there's a confidence factor. So you get consequence. I would
Absolutely.
add confidence factor. And that does affect time to revenue, or not only the loss of revenue at the point in time, but a time to revenue to regain that momentum in the market. And there has been publicly stated instances where it has been quantified by, you could see revenue coming to a certain, you know, slowing to a certain point after a downtime, how that's affected them, and then how they've even actually in quarterly releases have quantified that it was the downtime that affected us that has cost us X in, you know, forecast percentage of revenue growth, et cetera. So I do think that there is, I agree there's a consequence and embarrassment, which is more the brand reputation, but I think there is quantification, there's examples out there that makes it more than just, you know, the cost of a generator or whatever.
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
So I think that, you know, it really is, there's a lot of opportunities, and as data center practitioners and as technology practitioners, when quantifying the IT, you know, outage, it becomes where I think we have to think like how the business thinks, which is, what does that mean if I don't have the predictability and stability of what I'm delivering as value in services and products? And we have to link that to understand that your factory is actually in the data center, right? Or it's one of your factories. And that if that factory gets affected, it affects your revenue growth, it affects all your plans, and you're going to have to adjust. And what capital do you have at risk, right, that you've invested to build it out, those kinds of things. And I think that's what we have to start to think about when we're talking quantification of it.
From the operator side, the first step's very obvious. We have a service level agreement. In the event of an outage, there'll be a level of service credit. However, as an operator, we appreciate the level of service credit goes no way to fully compensate a customer for the effects of an outage. So from our side, the biggest concern, if we were ever to have an outage, would be from the reputational side. And it is exactly as you say, that is going to be a hit on sales forecasts, on revenue, on retained clients.
Yep.
We're very fortunate. We've never had to suffer one in 10 years of operation. We have never had a service credit which has had to be paid. But it's always out there, and it's always something which our operational guys know they are driving our sales process. And it's on them to continue to deliver that level of operational certainty to allow the sales guys to do their work.
Yeah, and I really agree. Everything can be boiled down to financial. But I think it's like doing a choice analysis that Hank Cedar was talking about earlier. If we want just numbers, we can really get tangled up trying to calculate numbers. One of the things we used to use is, what's the CIO going to do when he or she is at the golf club and all of that person's buddies come up and say, went down last week, huh?
Yeah.
I mean, that's not financially quantifiable, but it sure is real.
Yeah. Yeah, well, maybe a job too.
That's correct.
Well, you raise a really good point. That downtime computation, that's a big chunk of the risk piece of FORCSS. If you look at what that R component's made out of. And in looking to mitigate some of that risk, you got to quantify what you're putting in place in terms of investment. Now, yeah, it's hard to quantify pieces of that, but how do we do effective mitigation for downtime, in thinking about that larger sort of FORCSS framework? If it's going to be hard to quantify a hard dollar value, how do we look at investment to be able to go manage that and mitigate risk?
I think you hit it there, and I think it's a combination of investment. I think it's also a combination of portfolio. You have to look at the applications, and I think you've got to start to, and I think from the data center up, we have to teach business folks that all good and bad decisions manifest themselves in the data center, right? Because that's where the physical intersects with the digital. Mm-hmm. And when you think of that, you're really talking about the fact that not all applications that support the various business functions of the value chain of the business, right, necessarily require or have a substantial business impact. Getting into your HR benefits may upset employees and you have an employee satisfaction hit, but it doesn't necessarily affect revenue, right? Or it doesn't affect customer satisfaction, which can go back to the reputational side as you're talking about, Pitt. So I think there's another piece when you're going into the investments is, where do you need to protect that downtime where there is substantial items at risk? The same as if you were a service provider saying, I'm not going to get paid and I'm going to lose clients if this goes down, versus there are a significant number of copies of data, applications that aren't required to be always on, always available. So I think there's a top-down classification that has to occur with it. And I think to an investment standpoint, it becomes, can you afford to have this out for a minute, an hour, a day, a week, a month? And I think that's where you've got to, I think that kind of discipline has to occur, and that leadership has to come from the data center folks, I think.
It's interesting when you look at business decisions, because business decisions, I believe, are an emotional event surrounded by data and analytics. Someone has to call the ball. If the data and the analytics made the decision, we wouldn't have all these CXO offices running around. So I think part of what we're doing is, let's get all the data we can reasonably put on the table, and then add that contextual piece. I remember being in the president of a large corporation's office one time, and there had been a data center in the basement. The transformer blew up. They had an engine generator sitting on the sidewalk in a downtown location for like 4 months. And every morning, the president would look out the window, and the generator would be going put, 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 put. And there was a tremendous embarrassment, because this company is very, very community-oriented. And as we were doing the pitch, we basically looked at the president and said, the objective of this project, now that you've got all the numbers, is to never have that engine generator sitting under your window again. And he looked at me and he went, I like that idea. Signed here. I mean, yes, the data was there also, but that was that last little emotional piece that just closed it up.
So really what you're saying, Pitt, is that to the audience, we should have called this panel Quantifying and Qualifying the impact of an outage, not just quantifying.
Totally agree.
Okay.
Thank you for those words.
qualification from a service provider side, or is that more a straight economic decision for investment for you guys?
From our side, so where FORCSS is very interested for us is, and I think it was John from Fortune was saying the same thing, it's got two uses. Number one is for hard decisions in hard investment, and then secondly, we're increasingly seeing customers with that in hand and who are analysing us against those metrics. From our point of view, that's a very positive thing. The sales cycle for a big wholesale deal is 12 months plus. Any kind of instrument like this, which can make that process quicker and easier and more transparent for the customer, will hopefully make it quicker and more effective for us on the vendor side. So we're starting to see it, firstly, for something for us to make decisions, and secondly, for our customers to make decisions about us.
Makes a lot of sense. In terms of thinking about downtime and its influences on operation, where does that fit in maybe broad operational frameworks? So if you think about sort of overall operational capabilities like an ITIL, something of that sort of focus, where we're looking at delivered services. Does downtime factor into that kind of operational piece, and should that be an operational constraint in that model? How do we look at downtime in terms of the operational impacts in that way?
Within ITIL, isn't there a framework spot for service level? They don't call it service level
Service
agreement.
design.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is our intended delivery level, and if we miss it, we miss it, and that's all part of that structure.
Yeah, I just think it's a good point, Eric, because I think that, again, linkages, right? We have to in this industry, and I also want to throw a couple of stats too for people on quantification. Linkages really become, where and how. So as the data center evolves and as, a digital infrastructure and computing environment evolves, it's ubiquitous, it's always on, and so on. I think the linkages, this is where I think ITIL is actually going to become even a possible influencer to help the data center in the evolution of infrastructure, because if you aren't defining those service qualities in a manner that's both qualified and quantified, and you're not tying that across a set of service portfolios, right, so that by portfolio you can put the numbers and aspects around it, right, then I think, again, you're going to end up with a disconnect with it. And I'd be interested to hear, Adam, what you think there, especially how you guys use it to onboard or not clients. But the other thing, for a rule of thumb for you all to think about, is one, and I've seen this being both in my Wachovia and Morgan Stanley days, is that about 20% of the applications consume about 70 to 80% of the infrastructure. So if we actually put the quantification on that lens of that 20, and then associate how much of that is customer and revenue versus not, like things like backup, archive, email, right, SharePoint, and start to demarcate that, I think you could actually squeeze and start to put it in, because then you're talking about a much smaller subset of applications that you could then associate to your data center portfolio and start to put a quantification around that. That
In a
says,
much
okay,
simpler approach.
in a simpler,
Right,
more
absolutely.
quarantined,
Yep.
make sure this is absolutely there, and then from here, and then that makes the investment point you were talking about, Eric, a lot easier, because then I'm investing to protect these because the service definition is for this, or the risk and regulatory definition is. And then everything else, this is how we're doing it. So there's a nice arbitrage, that almost could be that for the dollar I invest here, I'm protected, versus the 5 to 50 that I could lose, right, in a simple math, versus over here for the dollar, if I lose it, it's really maybe $1.50, but it's going to be buried in my OpEx anyways.
I think to pick up on your point there, Tony, we're really starting to see that in requirements.
Yep.
For probably too many years, all we saw was continual one-size-fits-all, everybody wants tier 3.
Yep.
We're now starting to see a lot more requirements. In fact, by comparison, more coming down to tier 2
Yep.
than up to tier 4.
Yep.
So whereas previously you'd get a few asks around the tier 4 mark, now there's a lot more people who have analysed their portfolio. They have decided what's critical, what's not critical, and are then requesting lower levels of operational security and a lower cost around that space, having identified that separate from what they're going to invest more capital in, maybe keep even in-house at tier 3 and tier 4 facilities.
And we've always said the perfect tier is the one that best meets the business requirements. And the balance of that should be for that application or that group of applications.
Yep.
There's nothing magical about the biggest number is the best thing. The one that's best is the one that best matches the business requirements.
So mixed tiers,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
Is one of the things.
multiple.
Which means then, and obviously Uptime has put standards to the dollars for investment. But go the other way. There's another point for the crowd to think about, is that you have if you've ever been involved where there has been outages, the power's gone out, generators haven't worked, and you've ever had to live through that, even if you were the consumer of it, for the dollar that it is to invest to make it operate, you're going to take, I think I've seen in different ones on average, about $7 you spend in a fluctuation that you're going to end up impacting in your OpEx by dealing and suffering with an outage. So it's a hidden cost that I think we should be thinking about and folks should be, calling out, because by the time you get everybody that's involved in the business, nighttime, weekend calls, to everybody else, recovering and then stabilizing and then, doing the post-mortem, to then doing the changes, to then going through it, it becomes a very significant hidden cost that also has to be factored in. And it also then becomes an opportunity cost that you've got to put some quantification around, because the opportunity that you could have been innovating, that you're now trying to stabilize and fix the patient, becomes another nut to think about when you're putting a quantification that's, around it.
Yeah, potentially you've missed delivery of a new application that's critical. Yeah.
Well, and exactly the amount of, I don't know what I've generally termed unplanned work that kicks off. It's not just the time that things are down, but to your point, it's everything that ripples out of that. Now, is that an area that ought to be, we ought to look at quantifying on top of it? I mean, it seems like that ripple effect of that outage, if the upfront cost of quantifying downtime is tough, everything that flows out of that is going to be that much tougher. How do we start looking at that? We just factor
one of
7?
One of the things that's really interesting is in the worst possible outcome, where you have to declare a disaster and move your applications, worst possible outcome. Everyone talks about the effort to get out to the DR site. No one talks about the subsequent effort to come back.
Yeah.
Right.
And so here's all this hair pulling and midnight shipping and all this stuff, but it's a planned migration project, which is not cheap to bring them back, no matter what the size is. It's an event.
Stranded capacity, one-time expense hits, right? Unfocused on the innovation side, or new capabilities, and then you've got a multiplier of 3, 5, 10x somewhere, depending on the firm. Is the outage tied to a single data center and a subset of apps, or is it tied across a broader set? Or are you the type of firm that's only had in the data centers that you have, even if you colo them, I have all my apps in a pair, so then that becomes, then that's pretty significant. And that needs to be where, when folks are quantifying it or trying to help justify or validate with the strategies that are being taken to provide and protect an outage, that's where you start to get a formula that you can put together.
You also have the secondary hit of if it's a non-catastrophic outage, so there has been a problem, you've suffered the loss, but then the site is back up and running again. The likely corrective action for that is going to require another maintenance window, which is another level of increased risk going forward. So hopefully there won't be a second problem, but you're exposing yourself. Every maintenance window is an exposure to increased risk. You're running at reduced redundancy.
Sure.
So again, you're exposing yourself on a hard to quantify item.
So it's a thorny problem to look at broadly. Where does an organization that's wrestling with how to really quantify these capabilities start? If you had a first piece to look at, how do you sort out what those costs are? Is it a matter of finding those key applications and looking what the implications are? Or what's a good starting place?
I think you're exactly right. Both of you, find the most key applications. We did some work with a consumer product company, and their primary fear of a data center disruption was the disruption of the supply channel and an empty shelf in the retail location. Because once a consumer went, oh, my favorite product is not there, and their hand went to a different shelf, it may never go back. So that was their fear. They had it all set up to solve that fear. But absolutely, that was their key application, the biggest consequence, and then start there.
And it sounds like that's starting to say that you really need to look far beyond the data center, the application infrastructure, and this has to be a much broader business discussion to really quantify that effectively.
The business units have the answers. IT typically does not.
Yeah, and I think the other part is the consumption originates, of the data center to who those users are of those applications. And I think that means then you have to at least have a basic, simple understanding of how revenue originates, where touch points to clients or partners are, depending on the business model. And then you've got to look at, from there, well, and if you've got different business units, then you've got to look at it by business unit. So what's the revenue? What's the margin and profitability of that? And then tie that back to which apps do they use that affect that, to then which data centers do they run in. And I think you got to kind of break it down that way.
Now, and from a service provider perspective, I mean, you've got a much narrower scope. We've probably got a lot of operators and service providers out here. When you start looking at your customers, how far do you take it in terms of assessing what that impact is? Do you typically engage customers in that discussion, or really, how do you weight that from your perspective?
I mean, it really depends on the customers. Some customers want to really engage in that process. They want to explain what they want to deploy, how our facility will work with that kind of deployment, and they're the ones who are engaging into now the multi-tier approach. And I've been very simple here. I've said multi-tier. It's more than that. They're much more refined in that they want this level of support on the generators. They're not worried about something on the chillers. They're very, very specific requirements for different elements of their applications and different elements of the delivery we're going to give them. Other customers either don't have the information or choose not to engage with us. And they're buying a commodity.
And right, in those cases, you're giving them service, it's pretty straightforward.
Exactly. So it varies, and it's not as if financial customers go one way and the government or medical industry goes another. It really varies with the individuals involved.
Yeah, so not much variety in terms of vertical.
Exactly.
Even though the impact.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting things. So if we take a look, I was reflecting from George Schlesman's presentation, the I/O presentation earlier, and big smiles in the end. So talking about really starting to look at being able to bring that decision down into the actual reliability capabilities of that facility on which things are being implemented. Is there a point at which we sort of stand a lot of the downtime question on its head and start pushing back into facilities that have lower capability to meet those downtime requirements? As in downtime itself starts to drive back into the decision about what kind of facility to host on?
I think the bottom line is the reason that we want to quantify the cost, plural, or impacts of a disruption is to make an informed business decision. You cannot make an informed business decision if you only look at one side of an equation. So this is an insurance policy. That's all it is. Here's the impact financially of a disruption of our end user, our business function, and here's how much I am now willing to pay to offset it. And whether the payment, the costs to protect from that are through multiple data center, active-active, push it in the cloud, move the network around, whatever the solution is, that balance still needs to be made by an individual. Here's what happens when it doesn't work. Here's what I'm willing to pay to prevent it from happening. And that's a decision we make every time we individually buy an insurance policy, a car, whatever. And that's why you have to have it. We've had people come to us and go, this is such an obvious choice. We need to do this. And we go, well, what is the consequence? Well, we don't even want to talk about that. It's such an obvious choice. And those companies never get it approved because it's like saying, how much money do you want to spend? I won't tell you what the benefit is.
For us,
We've got this great insurance policy for you.
Yeah.
Just sign here.
Sign here.
Yeah, the FORCSS process for a customer is not going to give them the answer. It's a tool to allow them to get to the answer.
Right.
So I think, as Hank was saying, just give us the damn spreadsheet. That's not enough. It's going to give them the information and it's going to give them the questions to ask. But those questions are going to be different for every company, for every department, for every application within that company. And then it's saying how they weight it. So it's a method to the end.
Mm-hmm. A method to what is certainly a maddening process on some level.
Well, I think Mike Will said it well earlier on the panel, that he used the FORCSS algorithm twice in two different business contexts and came up with two separate answers. Both responses, both answers were correct for that business application.
A simple way to proceed forward. Now, in taking a look at how you look at, we were talking about impacts earlier, in terms of looking at how far you go in assessing impact, In looking at your typical operation, how far is a reasonable way to go in looking at impact? I mean, brand reputation, those kinds of things are a good first step. Is this something where there are some natural limits to how far that goes? And does that differ by business, by service provider, or typical enterprise?
I think you're dead right. It varies by the sector. So for us, as we said, it's a two-step. There's the service level side, which gives you a very simple financial effect, and then it's the reputation effect, which is then going to filter down into sales. It's going to filter down into repeat customers. So for us, we would take it as far as we possibly could to analyze that situation and evaluate it. I think for a financial customer, it's probably more challenging as to where you can actually draw the line, as to where that ripple down effect actually finishes.
Yeah, I think it depends by industry. I think it depends, again, the use case of the application, the function, because if it's a hospital and it's an operating room and it's tied to a data center, loss of life is probably something that we could borrow from the insurance industry and put a stochastic model on. So I think that's part of it. I think the other part too is it's fundamentally more of it means that this is indicative of a bigger problem coming. We have an explosion in data, we have an explosion in devices. We're just starting the explosion in devices, right? Call it the Internet of Things, call it whatever. So as you start to look at this, we can't sustain, right? So I think it's a bigger quantification is sustainability in terms of a business model, a computing model, a data center model, and where the world's going, because it's this sort of hybrid reality of humans, right, and physical environments and digital environments all coming together. And I think that people need to think about the quantification of downtime in terms of also, will the business exist, right? So I think there's, in some forms, there's even a bigger, because you start talking about 40, 80% ranges of compounded growth in storage, right? You start talking about the explosion in bandwidth consumption. You start talking about, as you start to look at that and what that does to, power and cooling and space and so on. It's a bigger question that I think for the sustainability of business. And the data center is just, again, where everything physically manifests itself now, so that you can actually correlate that back with them. I mean, that's what I would actually pose as a bigger thought idea.
Well,
and in the world of some verticals, let's call them financials, if you are a retail bank, for example, and you lose access to your data for X hours, the Fed will shut you down. I mean, so you bet your business.
That's where I'm going, yeah.
You just lost. Yeah. And
right.
that's may not, in that setting, you may not have to go very far down the application chute, quantifying things. And you just start with those big you bet your companies. Because what we do not want to do is to get so caught up in the analysis paralysis thing. Well, we have to quantify what loss of email means. But as long as you know that your order stream doesn't move through your email, you can probably just let it go. But if it moves through email, gosh, that's a revenue stimulator. You better pay attention to that one.
So there's some first principles that you ought to be able to slice through some of those basics to be able to make those decisions up front. Tony, I like your comment about really what that integration is in the business, the fact that the business is growing at that level. On the research side, we've sort of stumbled across the phrase, IT becoming too big to fail.
Exactly.
And the fact that because it winds up being so critical, does that wind up being, if IT has to continue, what does that actual shift look like? Is that displacement from a provider in the data center sense? Is it a shift from a service provider? Because it is a critical part of the way the business operates. So
maybe it's a shift towards the hybrid solution model, where there isn't just one solution, but you choose not only different levels of functionality, but different vendor paths and locations for all of your important things to reside.
Yep.
And hopefully a solid assessment gives you the tools to be able to figure out what those paths look like and where you have to be able to go. Now, I wanted to make sure that we have time for questions today, and we've got some folks with microphones back there. Any questions from the audience about downtime, its calculation, and really sort of how we work through it? Looks like we got a question down here.
Uh-oh.
We're a little blind in the front, so make sure you raise those hands high.
Hi, my name is Lex Koors. I'm representing Interaction here, carrier neutral co-locators. There is something I would like to say about multi-tier, about becoming less important, the tier classifications, higher or lower tiers. What we see in co-location typically is a turnaround. In the past, corporates had their own high tier certified data centers, and they try to use us, let's say, as co-locators as disaster recovery. But because we are sitting on top of the internet exchanges, because we have all the fiber, we have all the power, it's turned around. So the co-locators typically, they go up, high security, high tier availability, and they use their production plans, also the cloud, remote from our side. So they have the head ends in our data centers on top of the internet exchanges. So if you look at the fast growing industry, which is typically outsourced, co-location, whatever is there, you may even argue that the availability of the data center is going up instead of going down. If we talk about the massive production plants where they can lose some availability, sure, I agree. But if you look, let's say, at the critical components, we see the turnaround, I think, at co-location versus corporate.
A good point. I think if we take a look at the way that a lot of corporate data center or hosting infrastructures get provided, there certainly are opportunities for providers who can look at facilities that are more resilient, more secure, basically better capability. Is that what you're heading towards?
Yeah, and that's one. And secondly, don't forget that we also have, let's say, 100 to 120 carriers inside. So multi-homing, all these options are available. Carriers which are, let's say, showing not to be the best in availability. People typically change, so they still have to multi-homing. So we see that a lot. We don't see, let's say, in our co-location area that it is going down. We see people from financial institutes coming in, we see media coming in, we see cloud, we see all of these, also corporates, and they typically store the more important stuff today in the co-location. Strange enough, it was different before.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Thank you. All right. Other questions? One or two more? Sparked a few ideas out there? Oh, we got one back here.
So I'm interested in metrics. So have you found anybody who's been able to visually show uptime, say on a dashboard metric that you could track to your CIO level to talk about how good are you delivering your service? I like the redundancy part of it. How do you calculate redundancy, reductions in redundancy while maintaining uptime? Do you know anybody that's doing that well from a metric standpoint?
I know a number of people that have the kind of the count up clock on their dashboard. It's been this many days, hours, weeks, months, years, whatever, since we had something that qualified as a downtime event,
yeah.
however you wish to define it. We have probably a lot of different definitions we've seen. Another one is a weighting of downtime by the number of applications impacted. If it's a single application, and of course then importance of application would instantly need to get mixed in with that as well.
Yeah, I would say a couple of funky ones I've seen is transactions per KW, number of days of this kind of volume with no disruption, right? So as you start to get those leading CIOs, so from an ERP for IT kind of dashboard, where they're thinking of, so you could start to also correlate then other things like possibly revenue per square foot or revenue per KW, depending on how you do your allocations back. That would be some of the other ones that you may want to take a look at there, because I think you need to associate what you're accomplishing with the uptime, right? so that then it becomes an easier equation for the cost of the downtime or the trade-off of the risk of that. So it's a thought for you.
I think it's very difficult to bring the metrics together, because you can get to a situation where you're looking back on a 10-year life and maybe it are 5 outages of 1 hour the same as a single 5-hour outage. So I think you have to be very careful on the metric side, how you bring that data together.
I think there's a word choice thing that's very important here also. And it is changing with the hybrid solution suites that we see. But in the legacy world, or let's just say the enterprise data center world, people talk about importance of seconds, minutes, hours, and we don't see a data center facility-driven failure being minutes, seconds, hours. It's 4 to 8 hours before you get the end user to recover. So I think there is a language thing here too, and you talk about our data center is so important it processes X dollars, or we make X dollars of margin per small unit of time. It needs to be evaluated. What happens when it fails, and how much will you really lose? Because it's not going to be in seconds or minutes. And that's in context with one of the things Vince, I think, will mention tomorrow morning on Storm Sandy. It's not always in blocks of 8, 10, or 12 hours, because there was a service provider in Sandy that was down for 9 minutes before they needed to just repoint the network and they were back up.
Right.
That was a profound new solution set against the old enterprise world.
Okay, hi, Joel Stone from Savvis. So I'm a data center operator, much like Lex and eShelter and a lot of you guys out here. And one of the challenges that we have as operators is balancing draconian customer-imposed SLAs on us, and how do it sometimes drives the wrong operational or efficiency behavior to try to meet the stringent SLAs. And what I'm actually looking for is, I just got off a 2-hour meeting, it interrupted the conference, to talk about this customer SLA requirement that was just extremely stringent, basically absurd. And what I'd like to see is, could our Uptime come up with some good recommendations that would help change or shape some of this legacy behavior? Because what we have is, if you think about as operators in data centers, we have still a massive amount of people that are doing it themselves and operating and following bad behavior. And then they try to impose some of that bad behavior when they take their first baby step out into just buying taking the next step. So
yeah, they've been running their operation in crazy ways, and they're starting to impose that craziness on you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so what it comes down to, and I've worked in operations for 15 years, and when you have all 20 or 30 different types of SLA ranges that you're trying to manage, and you're playing a numbers game and risk and all that, and you talk about not really going down, and we rarely go down. It happens, but it would be really helpful if the Uptime could have a view and think about how they could help shape some of that legacy behavior that is out there, that would help them more efficiently operate their data centers, but help us as the industry try to push the bar forward.
Yeah. And I think part of that is simply pricing variation. If they want this, then there is this price associated with that, and if they want something less, there's a lower price, and let them make the decision.
Yeah,
Draconian as it may be.
Yeah, but they still have to meet shareholder requirements.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes. I think, and also sometimes it's not possible. And I think that's what we're talking about as well. Sometimes the level of thing we're asked for is not that we can put a price to it. We just cannot respond to that.
Right.
That's a level of service to meet that particular SLA. You just can't do it at any price.
Exactly.
And so it sounds like what you're looking for is, how do you step the customer back from what is that unreasonable position?
Well, yeah, I think that's a piece. I'm sorry, the other piece I think that they might want to think about is, where's the diminishing returns for the absurdness that they're asking, even though you are trying to get them in the door, right? So what you're saying is if we came up with a classification that sort of says, these are the types for these types of application workloads, if we want to say per se. These are the types of basic service definitions that would meet and fulfill it in a consistent manner, right? Just like a tier standard, if I think I'm hearing you right. And then from that, these are where the exceptions are. And at this point, we have found it's a diminishing return, right? So whether you did it yourself, you did it with us, you're still going to find that. Is that kind of a good summary back? Okay.
I think if you look at what happens, typically availability came from the grid suppliers. 3 nines, typically they had a few hours downtime a year. That was about right.
Yep.
When we applied it to data centers and we started talking about 5 nines, we're talking about 5 minutes. And we always explain that the likelihood that a 5-9 data center goes down is very rare. However, if a 5-9 data center goes down, you have a serious problem. It means that you have lost your generators, you have lost your grid, you may have run out of all of batteries, so there is a multiple hits at the same time on different types of equipment. And so what we typically say is the higher the availability, the likelihood of going down is there, but is not there. But if you have an issue, it's massive.
Yep.
Very true.
There's one.
Well, it looks like we're actually running low on time, so clearly there's a lot of follow-on discussion that we can pick up with this.
Can I do one more there, Matt?
Yeah, let's go to
Yeah.
Carl.
We do have one time for more?
We don't
All
have
right,
time for
well,
more,
let's-
but I always have time to hear from Carl, I guess.
I'd like to follow on the last comment and take us back to the future, as it were. When you have environments that exist like Amazon
Yep.
Web Services right now, very large, global, unified IT infrastructure environments that do suffer catastrophic data center downtime. They had a 5 nines data center go
Yep.
down more than once. Some of Amazon's customers went down with that. Many did not. If they followed Amazon's best practices, they did not go down when Amazon went down. Almost universally, right, because poof, go somewhere else. So what is the role of the data center? What is the role of quantifying downtime when environments like this predominate in certain sectors? Is there any role for, do you simply pick up the pieces, brush it under the rug and move on? Do you not need to take the responsibility on anymore? Where does quantifying downtime come into play when options exist?
Well, one of the things that drives me nuts about the 9.99, whatever number of nines you want to do, is that's not a design criteria, that's an outcome. And as an Uptime Institute representative, I will personally guarantee you 100% availability in every data center that's out there except when it's failed or shut down for maintenance. And so the number of nines is simply post-shutdown, post-failure recomputation of what it was over the last X years, but it's not a looking forward number. You know, and looking forward is, can you do maintenance without shutting this site down? Can you sustain a failure without shutting this site down? And I won't tell you what tier numbers are associated with those. You'll have to guess.
I think it's a good point. I think the answer is that convergence is hitting us, right? I said it earlier. Business, connected in a virtual workplace to virtual users, to applications and services, right, that consume IT kit, it's housed in some data center where it's provided, it's sourced, it's dedicated, so it doesn't matter, right? It's a fulfillment paradigm. So I'd say the answer is it's pretty friggin' important to data centers to push that. Because again, it's the intersection of physical meeting that digital paradigm, and we have to bring that together. So I actually think the onus is on the data center to say, okay, so what is cause and effect, and where in the layer of the stack, right? Where in the layer of responsibility? But oh, by the way, does that mean that it should be built more into the application because we're learning the application needs to be smarter, right? Or is it you're trying to make it on a physical standpoint, because then it does come back to that the cost to do it at the data center level versus the cost to do it at the application level becomes a great conversation to have. And I tell you, that's where I would kind of think and put it.
And as you move into a highly portable workload, you're exactly right. Now, how much does it cost to have the application be able to do that magic instead of some robust facility? It changes the nature of the discussion, but the principles are really the same.
Yep.
Gentlemen.
Okay. Great.
Thank you. Great session, guys. Thank you very much.
All right. We thank the panelists.